Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Phil Ryan, Trischool's Executive Editor, and I'm happy to be here with you today for Buddhist Masters of Modern China, a discussion with Professor Benjamin Brose. This is a Trischool Premium event, so a special welcome to our premium subscribers. And if you're not a premium subscriber, you can sign up at trischool.org/subscribe. This is a monthly event, and Trischool is a not-for-profit, so if you'd like to learn more about our mission or give a donation, please visit trischool.org/donate. We'll be leaving time at the end of the session for questions and answers, and we promise to get to as many of those as we can. And today's Zoom session will be recorded, so we'll share the replay link in a follow-up email. Our guest today is Benjamin Brose, Professor of Buddhist and Chinese Studies and Chair of the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of Michigan. He's interested in the cultural history of Buddhism and has written about the development of Chan, pilgrimage, translation, deity cults, and transcultural Buddhist exchange in East Asia. He's the author of numerous articles and books, including Embodying Xuanzang, the Postmodern Travels of a Buddhist Pilgrim, and his latest book, Buddhist Masters of Modern China, The Lives and Legacies of 8 Eminent Teachers. And we'll provide a link to pick up that book in the chat. One final note, Ben spoke with Trischool's Editor-in-Chief James Shaheen for the Trischool podcast, and that interview is coming out tomorrow. So listen at trischool.org/podcast or wherever you find your podcasts. So welcome, Ben.
Thanks, Phil. Happy to be here.
Great to be with you. So in the introduction to this book, you talk about some confusion in the West over Buddhism in China. Many Western Buddhists associate Chinese Buddhism with things that happened a long time ago, Weineng and figures from koans, and ironically, we know many of these figures by their Japanese names. And then after this period, there's a great silence from the Western perspective. And you write in your introduction that people will ask you, they have Buddhism in China, and be surprised. Can you talk a bit about why this might be?
Yeah. First, let me just say greetings from Ann Arbor. It's great to see everybody coming from so many different places. Thanks for taking the time to be here and to listen. It's a good question, and it's a complicated one, and I don't have a simple answer for it because I think there's a lot of different things going on. But I could highlight 3, maybe. One of which is the history of it's a Chinese-American Western relations throughout the past 150 years. So as many people will be aware, especially here in the United States, there has been a very fraught relationship between Americans and Chinese who have immigrated to this country beginning towards the middle to the end of the 19th century. Really, a lot of our harshest immigration policies were developed to stop immigration coming from China. And there's been an undercurrent of discrimination against China in this country that flares up on a fairly regular basis. It's flaring up right now, as a matter of fact. And I think that's one thing that's going on here, a general suspicion of things coming out of China that have caused some people to maybe not look at things as closely as they would otherwise. Another thing that is going on, anyone who is familiar with the Zen tradition as it's been established here in the United States or elsewhere in Western countries is familiar with the narrative that after Buddhism and especially Zen was transmitted from China to Japan, it essentially died out or became no longer vital or vibrant in China, and only existed in Japan. This is a narrative that is pervasive in Japan, Japanese scholarship, and among certain Japanese Zen teachers that I myself inherited when I first started studying Zen as a teenager. And so that's another thing that has almost been taken for granted in this country, at least, that true Buddhism was preserved elsewhere and kind of died out in China. And the last thing I'll say is that at the very time that Buddhism was getting established in the West, so 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, this is the worst possible moment for Buddhism in China. This is when the Cultural Revolution was happening, and Chinese Buddhism was almost destroyed in mainland China. And so anyone who was thinking about this at that time, when sort of the foundations were being laid here, could be forgiven for assuming that Buddhism was essentially wiped out at that time. Turns out that wasn't the case. It's much more resilient than that, and those roots run much deeper than a political movement can uproot. But it's led to a situation where most people in the US and Europe are not nearly as familiar with Chinese Buddhism as they are with other forms of Buddhism.
Yeah, so Buddhism has had some difficult times in China, various periods throughout its history, and has been viewed as an opposing or competing force to the national imperial governmental interest at times, and even called un-Chinese. So this is certainly the case in the period in the era your book covers, and perhaps right now. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so throughout the history of Buddhism in China, there has always been some segment of the population who is deeply suspicious, if not outright hostile towards Chinese Buddhism. Because when Buddhism was transmitted to China from India, China already had an extremely sophisticated philosophical system, soteriological system. And so with Buddhism being transmitted, there was a sense of it very much being a foreign tradition, and whether or not that was beneficial to Chinese society or a threat to, say, Confucian norms or other foreign philosophical positions has been an ongoing debate. And so, as you said, throughout history, there have been moments where there have been major persecutions of Buddhism. And one of the rationales for this is that it's not Chinese, it's a foreign tradition, and it's weakening Chinese society by introducing these new ideas. And so in the modern period, the period that the book covers, so this late 19th century up to the mid 20th century, that critique is brought up again, that it's not a Chinese system, and really it's not doing Chinese society any good, and they'd be better off without Buddhism. And so that is something that Buddhists have had to deal with, for almost 2,000 years in China, hasn't gone away. But I would say in the contemporary period right now, that's actually not one of the critiques. There's a sense that Buddhism has become Chinese in a very conscious way. The goal right now of the Chinese Communist Party is to sinicize Buddhism, and by that they mean to align it with the interests of the party state. And so it's not pushing it away as a competing source of authority, as has happened in the past, but trying to almost co-opt it as a way to further bolster the political aims of the state. And so it's shifted a little bit in more recent times.
This is not covered in your book per se, but there's a perception that as Buddhism came to China, it was sort of syncretized with Taoism, or even some people argue as Taoism in disguise, and that there was really a blending of these traditions. But at the same time, there was competition, of course, between them. Can you just tell us briefly about that?
Yeah, of course, competition, but also cooperation. Right? There's a lot of very interesting interweaving between Taoist traditions, Buddhist traditions, Confucian traditions, and a lot of people who are well versed in all of them, and see certain parallels, and use it as a creative force to think in new ways about some of these ideas and practices. But yeah, I think it's safe to say whenever any religious tradition moves from one cultural context to another, it changes in certain ways. It needs to adapt to that cultural context. And that's often a time of great vitality because people are thinking in new and interesting ways about how things line up. What are the parallels in the home culture, and how does that line up with the introduction of these new traditions and ideas? And when I teach this stuff in my classes, I just have people think about this moment right now. Buddhism in the United States, for example, all sorts of interesting things are happening that there's no precedent for in the history of the tradition because people are trying to make sense of it in our own terms, right? And using the language that makes sense of us, whether that's therapy, science, whatever. And so the same thing is going on throughout history. And in China, when Buddhism is first introduced, what is a bodhisattva? Well, there's this category of immortals in Taoism, and those seem quite similar. So maybe we're talking about the same thing and just using different words for them, right? And you have so many concepts within Buddhism, of course, where there is no good translation. What is the Dharma? That's a complicated word, right? And there's a reason why in English we say Dharma and we don't try to translate it into an English word because it's a unique concept. And so the same sorts of things are happening in China 2,000 years ago when they are confronting these texts and these ideas and these practices for the first time. They're trying to make sense of it on the basis of their own understanding of the world. And it leads to some really interesting things. And a lot of the traditions that we have of Chinese Buddhism today are the product of that. Zen Buddhism, Chan Buddhism is a product of that kind of thinking through these relationships between Indian models, Chinese models, and so forth.
So some of these oppositional forces we discussed earlier in the modern period led to pressures for monastics to disrobe or not join monasteries, and you tell stories of families running and bringing their kid home from the monastery. But it also led to great innovation and a revival of the tradition, which is obviously a central theme of this book, which presents portraits of 8 teachers. Can you say a bit about the pressures faced in the modern period and maybe 1 or 2 ways that Buddhist leaders address them?
Sure. Yeah. At the beginning of the 20th century, China, as a lot of people will already be aware, is essentially embattled on multiple fronts. They are being occupied by Japan, England, the United States is knocking at the door. There's all sorts of missionaries that are making inroads and converting very prominent people in China. So there's really a sense that China has become very vulnerable. It could go the way of Korea, which has become a colony, Taiwan, Hong Kong, the Philippines. Right? This is the colonial period still, and people are aware of the fact that the military in China cannot compete with the militaries of, say, Russia, Japan, or Europe. And so there's a sense that they need to rethink things. The imperial system, which had survived for over 2,000 years, falls apart, and there's nothing immediately to replace it. So it's a time of tremendous change, tremendous precarity in China. And so when people are thinking about the way forward, one way of thinking was that these old traditions that they have followed for so long and valued for so long have become an impediment. What needs to happen is a kind of rapid development, industrialization, an embrace of science, possibly an embrace of democracy or other political models. What they don't need, according to many people, are these old traditions, Buddhism being one of them, which don't seem to contribute anything to the defense of the nation, to the economy, all these things that seem really vital at that time. And so there's a tremendous critique of the Buddhist tradition and the monastic order in China. You have men in monasteries that could be working, that could be serving in the armed forces, that could be paying taxes. So why don't we just get rid of these people, get rid of Buddhism altogether? It would strengthen the country. This is one line of thinking. So monastics, of course, are feeling this pressure, and they're feeling the need to respond and to demonstrate that they do have value. And they do this, to speak about it very broadly, in 2 different ways, described in the book in some of these profiles, one of which is kind of what I call back to basics, right? There is this great tradition, tried tested, and it's worked for thousands of years, and it still works today, and it's about practice and realization. And so for people in this camp, it's about going back to traditional practices, traditional texts, traditional understandings, traditional models of running a monastery and so forth. And so they went all in. If you're a Chan person, if your practice is Chan or Zen Buddhism, you do that 110%, right? And you try to achieve results. That's the best thing you can do to become awakened, help others. That's the best contribution you can make to society. So this is more of a conservative approach. The other end of the spectrum are monks and lay people who said, actually, these old systems, they were developed a long time ago. They couldn't anticipate the kind of changes that we're seeing in the modern world, globalization, radically new understanding of the way the world works through science and physics and so forth. And Buddhism needs to adapt. They need to master modern knowledge, forms of technology, and so forth. They need to not disengage from society, but engage, become involved in politics, become involved in social outreach. So the kind of social engagement that we're so familiar with in the West actually develops in China during this time through monks, nuns, lay people who want to demonstrate that they really have a vital role to play in society, creating hospitals, orphanages, universities, doing relief work, and so forth. And so they went a different direction from these other monks and nuns. But all together, they were all responding to the same sets of pressures, but they just did it in their own individual ways.
You mentioned monastics removing themselves from the workforce, but more broadly, how did monasteries, some of which were quite large, how did they fit into the economic system at the time?
Yeah, so traditionally, there's all sorts of different types of monasteries throughout the history of China, from very, very large estates, which are very wealthy and may own massive tracts of land that will be rented out to tenant farmers to produce income for the monastery. These institutions become very, very wealthy, and they have a large set of assets that can be passed down generation to generation. Everything from that to very small hereditary temples that may just have, a handful of monks or nuns sort of passing that down generation to generation. But they've always functioned more or less economically independent through donations, through running industries in some monasteries, lending money, farming, etc. One major shift that happens in the modern period is land reform. And so the land that these major monastic estates once owned, that provided all the funding for sometimes hundreds of monastics living in one temple, that's taken away. And so their main sources of income are withdrawn, and suddenly they have no sources of support anymore. Many of the donors also stop donating large amounts of money to monasteries. So for the first time, they really have to rethink their economic structure, their place within society. And so you see all sorts of creative solution to self-sufficiency in a really interesting way. There's a whole movement to combine farming and Chan practice, for example, that still exists today, where you have monks, nuns out there tilling the fields, whether they're growing tea, growing crops, selling those for their livelihood. And then you have, at the more famous monasteries, they'll charge a fee at the door. You get a ticket to go in, and that's another source of income. Performing rituals, whether that's funerals or other types of rituals. So they had to get creative about different ways to sustain themselves in this very, very fluid social political situation.
In Japanese Buddhism, we're familiar with a lot of single practice traditions, and Pure Land is a distinct tradition, has its own centers and so on. And in China, apparently there was more mixing or confluence of these traditions in monastic centers. And then, of course, a lot of the figures in your book are struggling against that and trying to pull the traditions out a little more separately. Can you talk a bit about how that confluence of traditions might have affected practice in monastic centers, at least in the early modern period?
Sure. Yeah, so people who are familiar with Japanese Buddhism, as you've said, are we almost take for granted a sectarian nature of the tradition, right? So if you are a Zen monk, you do Zen, and that's all that you do. And it would be very strange for you to suddenly go engage at a Pure Land monastery. So you have Pure Land, you have Tiantai, you have esoteric Buddhism, and these are separate spheres in Japan. That has never been the case in China, where it has always been more of a model of you may have certain monasteries where the abbot is renowned as a Chan practitioner or a Pure Land practitioner or a Tiantai practitioner, and people will go there to study that. But if you're inclined to do recitation, there's a place in the monastery where you can do recitation. If you want to study texts, there's a place in the monastery where you can study text. So I think of it sometimes almost like a university, where certain universities may be known for being really good at one particular thing, but of course they have a whole range of different subjects that students can study. And so monasteries, by and large, within China, encompass not the entire range of the tradition, but many different traditions in the same sort of monastic complex. There are a few exceptions, which I talk about in the book, where some monks are adamant that there's one particular method, which is the most effective method. And so in their monasteries, that is all that they'll allow. And so I profile one monk, he's a Chan monk, and in his monastery, you can't do anything other than Chan practice. If he catches you doing that, if he catches you reciting Amitabha Buddha's name, doing Pure Land practice, you're out. If he catches you studying a sutra, you're out. If you try to perform a ritual, go find somewhere else to live. And so there are some, more, I guess you could call them sectarian figures within Chinese Buddhist tradition, but they are the exception, not the rule. By and large, the sense is, as one famous monk puts it, it's like medicine. There's all sorts of different types of treatments, and it depends on what a person needs. You may be inclined towards one type of practice or another, and that may change throughout your life. They all work. They all are leading you to the same place. And so whatever works for you, do that thing. That's kind of the general sense.
You mentioned Tiantai and Huayan, and these are traditions that are not as well understood in the West, but were of great importance in China. Can you just briefly talk about them?
Yeah, these are both early traditions that really predate the tradition that most people are probably familiar with that comes out of China, which is Chan. And so Tiantai Buddhism, the older, earlier model of Buddhism in China was centered around different types of sutras. And so the Tiantai tradition takes the Lotus Sutra as the preeminent sutra, as the most important sutra that encompasses everything within the tradition. And so this developed into a very complex and sophisticated philosophy. This develops during the Six Dynasties period, so say 5th, 6th century in China, and remains kind of an undercurrent of all of Chinese Buddhism. Huayan, that is the Chinese pronunciation for the Avatamsaka Sutra, which is translated into English as the Flower Garland Sutra. And this is another very complex philosophical tradition discussed somewhat in one of the chapters of the book. Both Tiantai and Huayan are dealing with similar doctrinal positions about the nature of reality and the relationship between self and other and emptiness. And they just do so in somewhat different ways. And really, these traditions, they don't develop into independent sectarian traditions. What they do is form the foundation for much of Chinese Buddhism. And so within the Chan tradition, it's infused with Tiantai thought, Tiantai meditation practices. It's infused with a Huayan understanding of emptiness and relationality between the one and the many. So there's one story I think about when I think about the relationship between Chan and these other traditions. There was once, Tiantai is named after a mountain site in southeastern China named Mount Tiantai. It means heavenly terrace. And I spent several weeks living there years ago. And I once visited this spectacularly beautiful monastery. There's this very famous natural stone bridge that's arches over this waterfall. And beside the waterfall, there's this small Buddhist temple where just a few monks lived. And I was once wandering around there and invited in for tea. And the head monk there was this very well-cultivated individual. He was a calligrapher, he was an artist, he was quite knowledgeable. And when he learned that I was interested in Chan, he said, "Oh, come with me." And he took me into his study, which was just filled, it was just wall-to-wall books, a whole section on Tiantai, a whole section on Huayan, a whole section on Pure Land. And he was showing me these books. And he sort of waved his hand. He said, "You're interested in Chan? You read all of these, and then you can start to think about Chan." And it runs counter to the way we normally Zen people think about Zen. You do away with texts, burn the sutras, kill the Buddha, do away with these concepts. But his point is that to really understand what's going on with Chan, you have to see that it encompasses the entire Buddhist tradition, just at a very high level where that can be left behind because it's been fully penetrated, for him at least. And so these other traditions that really haven't found their way here to the United States or elsewhere, except in very, very rare cases, they still exist, right? They're still within the Chan tradition, and anyone who studies Chan texts carefully can see there's all this philosophical assumptions that are underpinning some of these stories, and that's coming directly out of these other traditions.
You mentioned the university model of monasteries, which is very interesting for the monastics there. How would it be for the lay people coming to the monastery? Would they have traditions they would adhere to or certain practices? How might they interact with these multi-tradition monasteries?
Yeah, it's a unique characteristic of the modern period. One of the many major shifts that's going on within Chinese Buddhism at this time that makes it so interesting. So traditionally, as in other Buddhist cultures, the lay people's job was just to support, right? You make donations, maybe you come and engage in some kind of a group ritual or something like that. But the idea is that you're not going to engage in serious practice. Your best chance is to create merit so that in your next life you can become a monk or a nun, and then make real progress. In the modern period, the lay people were really empowered. They had access to these texts. They were very well educated, and a lay movement developed, which took study of Buddhism and the practice of Buddhism very, very seriously. So we start to see throughout history, there have been a few, at least that we know about, accomplished lay people, but they were very, very rare. And in the modern period, you have many, many lay people, and some of them are profiled in the book because they later go on to become monks or nuns. But feel like they're just as competent, if not more so, than monks and nuns, right? They have their own academies. They will go and participate in retreats and study alongside the monks and nuns and not see themselves as any lesser necessarily. So even today, when I've been in extended retreats in China, I'm one of many lay people that will be in the meditation hall. Right? It's a serious, similar to the way it is now in the West, but in the West, it's, as you know, primarily almost exclusively lay people. There is still a strong lay contingent in China, and it's created some very interesting synergy between monastics and lay people and kind of the networks they build together.
Several of the articles mentioned a Buddhist periodical, The Sound of the Sea Tide, which caught our attention here at Tricycle, being another Buddhist periodical. What can you tell us about this magazine, or however it appeared, and what was its influence?
Yeah, so that's your precursor. It's actually super interesting, and yet another one of these important shifts. For the first time ever, around 1910, 1920s, we start to see the emergence of Buddhist periodicals for the first time in China. And this is really revolutionary if you think about it, because people are able to exchange ideas at a distance, and you have all sorts of people engaging in a conversation that spans the entire country. It's never happened before. And The Sound of the Sea Tide, Hai Chao Yin, was one of the most successful of these. It was one of the earliest, and it was also the one that endured the longest. Many of these put out a few issues and then sort of faded away. This one became quite prominent, and so you have many of the major monastic leaders, as well as lay people, as well as intellectuals and critics, all writing and responding to each other in the pages of this magazine. So it has left us this incredibly rich record of what was going on. All these reports that people are offering of conversations they've had, places they've visited. It's a great snapshot of life at that particular time. And so that's kind of become one of the flagship Buddhist journals in China. And interestingly, it's just been revived a few years ago. It's stopped circulation for decades, and in recent times, it has been brought back. And so it's now publishing once again. So it's not done yet.
Wow, interesting. So there's a figure called Ben Kong in the book, who's a laywoman who then becomes a more serious ordained practitioner. So I want to talk a bit about the role of women and female monastics. And in times of stress, in other places, in Sri Lanka, for example, female monastics were more vulnerable, in a more precarious position, and in the Theravada countries basically disappeared entirely. What's the case in China? And what was the road like for women looking to ordain?
So historically, the nuns order in China was established just after the monks order, so almost simultaneously. And so for the last 1700 years, there has been a constant nuns order that has existed alongside the monks order, separate institutions. They don't live together, they're segregated by gender. But it has always been there. And we hear a lot less about them because they are not the ones who are usually writing the texts or preserving the text and putting the text in the canon. So it's much harder to recover their voices, but there are all sorts of interesting sort of glimpses of them throughout the history of Chinese Buddhism. And some scholars have been doing fantastic work trying to excavate their voices. In the modern period, it continues, right? There has been and continues to be a very robust order of nuns within China. And just from my own personal experience, they tend to be some of the sharpest, most accomplished monastics that I often meet, because to a certain extent, they're not subject to the same pressures that some of their male counterparts are. The flip side of that is that, as has been baked into the Buddhist tradition from the very beginning, they are accorded less rights. They're regulated much more strictly. There's a subservience that's been built into the nuns order that goes back to India, and that has continued throughout the Buddhist world. The road to becoming a nun, historically, this was regulated by the state. I could say, in this year, we will allow 500 monks and 300 nuns. And that's now is not the case. Nuns are free to ordain. There's a lot of prejudice against this, a lot of suspicion about what goes on in nunneries from people who are hostile towards Buddhism. But there is a very robust nuns order and some very accomplished female masters who are doing remarkable work that's not as well seen as what some of the male monks are doing. And in places like Taiwan, interestingly, which has kind of evolved in a slightly different direction than mainland China, the vast majority of monastics are nuns now. It's something like a 3-to-1 ratio, 3 nuns to every monk. And so they are really the driving force of the Buddhist traditions in Taiwan, although they're often not in leadership positions, with one notable exception. People may be familiar with the group Tzu or Compassionate Relief out of Taiwan, who have done a lot of international relief work in disaster zones and so forth. And that is an all-female order led by a female teacher that done really remarkable things. And that's coming out of some of these rethinking of the tradition as something that needs to be more engaged socially. That's coming directly out of that.
Yeah, she's really remarkable. We have a book review about Tzu Chi coming out in a issue coming up. Amazing story. The notion that Chan had degenerated in China, which was maybe pushed by D.T. Suzuki and others for whatever reason, that notion became widespread, but we can see in your book with Lai Guo and Shuyun and others, this is not the case. Can you talk a little bit about Chan specifically and its situation in the beginning of that period and what evolved during the modern period?
Yeah, I mean, Sean, you could talk about that as kind of a case study of really what was happening to various Buddhist traditions at that time. As I sort of alluded to before, it was a really rough time for everybody in China and monastics in particular. And one of the reasons for that is that in the middle of the 19th century, there was a figure who, through a series of visions, came to believe that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. And he went on to set up his own sovereign state. It's called the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, and to launch a rebellion that lasted almost 16 years, I think, and was incredibly violent. It created what's essentially a civil war in China that led to, by some estimates, 20 million deaths. I mean, an incredibly, one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history, all in the name of trying to transform China into a Christian state, according to this person's very idiosyncratic understanding of Christianity. One of the targets of that, not surprisingly, was Buddhism as, a competing force to Christianity, as idolater in the minds of very conservative Christians. And so the home base of this kingdom was in the city of Nanjing, which is in southeastern China and really is in the heartland of Buddhism in China, this area where many of the main monasteries, the largest monastic populations are. These monasteries were completely destroyed. The monks and nuns, if they weren't able to escape, were killed. And it was just laid to waste, basically. Eventually, the rebellion is defeated, but there's a wasteland. The monasteries have to be rebuilt. Practices have to be, reestablished in these places. And so at the beginning of the 20th century, they're rebuilding, right? It's, the amount of lumber involved to rebuild, hundreds, if not thousands of monasteries and to bring people back. So they were in this mode where they had just been dealt a very, very harsh blow. And then you have these new critiques that are coming that I talked about before. And so for Chan monks like Lai Guo, like Shu Yun, who's also known as Empty Cloud, people may be familiar with him, they are really feeling like they need to revitalize and reestablish their tradition, not because there's been some historic decline through syncretization or anything like that, because they had just been essentially destroyed. The monasteries had been destroyed, practices had been disrupted. And so the work that these people are doing is raising money to rebuild temples, writing monastic codes to regulate monasteries, to teach monks the rules, reestablishing practices, and so forth. And so you get these figures who are, that is their single mission, is to preserve and revitalize these traditions, which they see as the most important traditions, not only in all of Buddhism, but in human history for them, right? This is the pathway to awakening and liberation. And if it's lost, who knows when we'll regain it again. So they really put themselves on the line to try to make sure that these traditions would be preserved. And I think they succeeded.
So, like what you referred to earlier, about the strict rules in the monastery, I think you might have discussed him more extensively on the podcast, but can you give the listeners here a flavor of what he was like?
Yeah, he was a very intense individual. He was kind of unwavering in his discipline and devotion to the Chan tradition, to the extent that he spent really years as a homeless monk, wandering barefooted, wearing rags, sleeping outside, eating one meal a day, all in, pursuing his what's called Huatou practice, similar to Japanese koan practice, trying to have a breakthrough, which he eventually does have through a very dramatic experience, and eventually takes up the abbacy of one of the most prominent Chan monasteries within China. And he holds his monks to a very, very high level of discipline. This is what we were talking about before. If you break the rules, you're done, right? And so we have his talks, we have his own writings about his own life. There's a rich body of material to understand his teachings and his methods. But basically, what he was teaching monks and nuns, both sat meditation retreats together, was the practice of focusing on what's called a critical phrase, and using that as a meditation topic. So it's similar again to koan practice, except they, instead of using, does a dog have Buddha nature, like you might do in Rinzai Zen, his koan was, who is it that's reciting the Buddha's name? Who are you that are making these recitations, that are going through these motions? What is your real identity? Where did you come from? Where will you go? These sorts of existential questions. People were to do that to the exclusion of anything else. Right? Do it while you're sitting meditation, but also do it when you're eating breakfast and when you're going to sleep and when you're going to the bathroom. Every moment of one's activity is supposed to be laser focused on this one topic. And for him, that had the potential to bring someone to an experience of awakening.
And it worked for him. It happened for him, right? He describes it. You describe it in the chapter.
Yeah, I mean, there's all these remarkable testimonies of monks, whether it's Shuyan or Laigo or many other figures who talk about their process and sort of the difficulties they encountered and the resolution of those difficulties. So it's a really fascinating thing to have access to as someone who's trying to make sense of that tradition.
It struck me reading the book, there were a lot of these figures, they were very serious practitioners, but they were also great artists. And then just the monk you mentioned at Tiantai Mountain was also doing calligraphy and so on. What is the overlap there between these talents?
Yeah, I mean, I can only speculate, and other people may have other ways to read this, but in my own experience, there is a lot of overlap between people who are artistic and creative and who are also practitioners. I think there's kind of a searching and an attempt to embody and express something that goes beyond sort of ordinary language and ordinary experience that you find both in poetry and in music and in practice, right? And so I think it's not that surprising that you have people who are really accomplished in one field also throw themselves into forms of Buddhist practice. And the person in the book who exemplifies this best is this monk named Hong Yi, who Raoul Birnbaum has a great chapter in the book. And he's an artist, he's a musician, he's an actor, he's kind of this Renaissance man. And he ends up having something of a midlife crisis triggered by an illness that he walks away from everything. He was kind of embodying the best that modern China had to offer, but for him, that wasn't enough. And he threw himself into Buddhist practice, a complete turnaround in lifestyle, leaving a very simple Spartan life, and became one of the most renowned and revered monastics in modern Chinese history, still to this day, incredibly influential. And there too, you see someone who had all this creative energy and poured that into his Buddhist practice. So the two work together, although the expectation, as you will have seen in the book, is that when you become a monk or a nun, the idea is you leave most of that behind because it can become a distraction from your practice. But certain traditions, calligraphy is one, is still seen as okay to engage in.
All right, one more question before we get to our audience questions. So you talk about, I think it was Taishu who encouraged monks to travel outside China and go and look for new or read new material or rediscover material. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. Justin Ritzinger has a chapter on Taishu in this book. He's one of the great reformer trying to have Chinese Buddhism adapt in a way that will make it more relevant to the modern world, to modernize it in certain ways. And one of many things that he saw as important to that is for Chinese Buddhism not to be insular, not just to be a tradition that looks to its own history, but to have it be a completely inclusive tradition that incorporates all elements of the global Buddhist tradition. And again, this is new, right? This hasn't happened before in Buddhist history, where you have monks in one country in regular communication with monks in other parts of the world, right? Occasionally you have a pilgrim that will go back and forth. But here he's sending monks to Tibet that will spend years there learning Tibetan, translating Tibetan texts, reintroducing them to China to reinvigorate certain elements of Chinese Buddhism that he saw as having been lost historically, sending monks to Japan to study esoteric Buddhism, to look for texts that had been lost in China but preserved in Japan. Going on tours, he himself went to Europe, he went to India, sent monks to Sri Lanka. So an attempt to really build a global Buddhist community, something that we now take somewhat for granted, but at that time, that was revolutionary, right? To try to unite Buddhists in different parts of the world and to learn from each other and to use that as a way to strengthen the tradition.
Yeah, and traveling seemed like it was important. Was it Liguo who started walking to India?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people pilgrimage then as now was a major part of the tradition. And so people walking very long distances, both in order to visit certain sites, sacred sites, but also as a practice in and of itself to go slowly, to go by foot, to engage with people along the way. There are these great stories, from thousands of years ago, not thousands, 1,000 years ago, of monks engaging teachers while on pilgrimage. That still happens, right? It's still a part of the tradition.
Okay, we're going to go to some Q&A from the audience now. Again, if you want to pose a question, you can put it in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. So Eduardo asks, how are koans used in the practice of modern Chan? I guess you could talk about, is Watto still a vital tradition?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I was touching on that briefly. Um, Huato are very much still used in the Chan tradition. The way it differs from Japanese Zen, especially Rinzai Zen, is for those that are familiar with Rinzai Zen, there is a vast number of koans that one works their way through over a pretty long period of time. And the idea is that each is sort of touching on aspects of the Dharma from a different perspective and different ways to embody it. In China, traditionally, there is one works on a single huato, which means sort of critical phrase. And to fully penetrate that is thought to resolve, basically to trigger a kind of awakening experience so that it's no longer necessary to keep doing other ones. You should be able to answer them all if you've truly answered one. And so, as I said, the one that Laiguo advocates is Nian Fo Shi Shui, which means who is it that's reciting the Buddha's name? Other popular ones are who is it that's dragging this corpse around? Things like that. So there's different ones that can be used. Different teachers may favor different ones, but it's very much the centerpiece of Chan training, for the last many hundreds of years within China.
Another question from Eduardo, is transmission different in modern Chan than Japanese Zen?
Transmission remains the same, essentially. The master will decide when there's different types of inheritance within the Chinese monastic tradition, but in terms of Chan transmission, yeah, it's master to disciple, theoretically mind to mind transmission, as the Japanese model is based on the Chinese model, and so that has remained more or less the same.
And then Randall asks, what's the relationship of Chinese Christianity to these Buddhist practices, particularly Catholicism? And he brings up the character who was involved in the rebellion, Jesus's younger brother.
The role of Christianity in a lot of the stuff I've been talking about is actually extremely important for a number of different reasons, but without going on too long about it, the Christian missionaries, when they first started coming to China and really became established in the late 19th, early 20th century, um, they were really successful. They were spreading and converting people and had a tremendous influence on Chinese society because it was wrapped up in the whole package of Western thought, Western technology, Western forms of government, economics, and so forth. Christianity was a part of that. And so to adopt modernity to a certain extent was to adopt Christianity. And it's important for Buddhists because they were seeing quite clearly what was going on with Christianity and how successful they were. And it required them to respond. And what they often did was to look at what was working for Christians and find their own form of that. Right? And so we talked about social engagement, right? Building orphanages, hospitals, things like that. That's coming directly from Protestant Christianity in China. There is a YMCA, right, the Young Men's Christian Association. There is a YMBA, the Young Men's Buddhist Association. So they started to parallel this, having Sunday talks, that sort of thing, transforming themselves, not just simply mimicking Christianity, but looking for new models and basing that on Christian forms. And so a lot of the changes that took place, especially for the modernizing monks who were interested in modernizing, a lot of that was drawn from Christian precedents.
And then Randall again says, what percentage of the Chinese population is Buddhist, and do individuals participate in more than one tradition?
It's a little hard to say what percentage is Buddhist at present, in part because, as in a lot of Buddhist cultures, people might not necessarily identify as Buddhist, and yet they're engaging in Buddhist practices. And so I don't know, and it's very hard to trust some of the census data that comes out of mainland China. It's a probably a relatively small percentage, I would guess, maybe in the single digits, but I'm just guessing. And is it common for people to engage in multiple practices? The most common practice, throughout Buddhist China and probably throughout the Mahayana Buddhist world, certainly the case in Japan as well, is Pure Land practice, which has to do with reciting Amitabha Buddha's name. That's incredibly widespread. But then you have lay people that will engage in all sorts of things. They may do some Buddha name recitation. They may do some Chan meditation. They may study the Lotus Sutra. So really, people follow their interests and follow their inclinations, and may focus just on one thing, single-mindedly, or they may sample different types of practices in the same way that people do in the U.S. as well.
Yeah, I think the question was getting at Confucianism, Christianity, Taoism, as well as other practices that.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, the Confucianism is it's so interwoven with Chinese culture that it's hard for anyone to really consider themselves disentangled from that, and so it just forms the foundation of so much within China that all Buddhists, to a certain extent, are following certain adherents of Confucian principles. Taoism is a little bit more complicated because there are very high level schools of Taoism, monastic schools with very sophisticated types of practices and philosophies. And then there's just a common sort of more popular Taoist tradition, certain deities that you may pray to or make offerings to, or certain rituals that may be performed, that people don't necessarily make distinctions, say, between Guan Yin, Avalokiteshvara, one of the most popular bodhisattvas in China, and a figure like Matsu, who is like the Taoist parallel. They make offerings to both. Why would you not hedge your bets if you're wanting to get some kind of result? So at the common level, yeah, there is a sense that it's all part of the same world, and certain Buddhism is good for certain things, Taoism is good for certain things, Confucianism is good for other things, and depending on what your goals are, you may turn to a different tradition.
There's a question from the chat. It's now also in the Q&A. You mentioned Tiantai, and the questioner has also visited there. And the questioner wonders about the importance of the poet monk Han Shan and the significance in development in the Buddhism in the modern period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the poet Han Shan is so for the people who don't know, is associated with a monastery on Mount Tiantai called Guoqing Monastery, and it's said that his cave is located nearby. And I once spent a very long day tracking down that cave. So if you don't know Han Shan, his name translates to cold mountain. His poetry, Gary Snyder has famously translated some of it's really, really beautiful poetry. It has become important within the Chan tradition. He was seen as kind of a little bit of a trickster figure and a recluse. It's important. It's not people will be familiar with it as just an important part of the Chinese poetic and Buddhist tradition, but it's certainly not a central part of, say, a monastic curriculum or anything like that.
You mentioned we're close to running out of time, but you mentioned southeastern China as the cradle or heartland of Buddhism. Could you just explain a bit about that?
Yeah, so southeastern China, historically has been one of the more wealthy areas, and it's also been a place that has preserved elements of traditional Chinese culture, somewhat more so than northern areas because of the sort of series of invasions in the north and occupation in the north. Certain things were preserved in the south. And that's just for, a very long time has been one sort of the center of gravity of the Chinese Buddhist world, in part because of the wealth there that was available to support monasteries, in part because of the culture there, and in part just because of tradition perpetuating itself. So that even today, many of the most significant monasteries, both historically and in terms of contemporary importance, are located in southeastern China. Certainly not all of them. There's a lot of really, really important monasteries throughout China, in the north and in the southwest. But southeastern China, so if you know China, the provinces of Zhejiang and Jiangsu, Jiangxi, Fujian, those form the real cradle of Buddhism in China, and that still remains the case today.
Okay, final question is about contemporary China. With the oldest known text being the Diamond Sutra found in China, is there an increased desire to historically validate China's influence in the preservation and authenticity of Buddhism? Or is this type of archaeology heavily controlled by the PRC?
Yeah, so the oldest printed text, we should add that caveat, not the oldest text, but the oldest text that was printed by woodblock technology. And yeah, there is a robust effort among Chinese scholars and archaeologists to uncover, preserve, document all these things, because it's a source of tremendous pride, as it should be, the heritage of Buddhism in China and its contributions to technologies like printing and many, many other things. And so, while yes, there is a degree of oversight that's happening at the political level, this is exactly the kind of thing that's many people in China want to see celebrated rather than suppressed. It's this notion that there's a lot of pride right now in traditional Chinese culture, and so these sorts of things are really celebrated and advertised. So there's not an attempt to suppress them.
Okay, one last question just popped in. We'll treat it very briefly. Relationship between Chan and Tibetan Buddhism. What is the relationship? You mentioned the Tibetan texts earlier.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is that there's not really much of a relationship. Historically, as people may know, there's the story of a great debate that was staged when Buddhism was being introduced to Tibet, and there was an Indian monk and a Chinese Chan monk, and they had a debate. And the story goes that the Chan monk lost, and so that they turned to India rather than to China. The historical accuracy of that is not entirely clear, but historically, it's certainly the case that while there are, certain parallels perhaps between some forms of Tibetan Buddhism and Chinese Chan, there's very little interaction, except maybe in the modern period when they start talking to each other again. But they've really remained pretty distinct spheres of practice.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Ben. Great to talk to you.
Great, my pleasure. Thanks for the good questions. Enjoyed it.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We will send you a replay of this event in a follow-up email later today. And again, Tricycle is a not-for-profit. If you'd like to subscribe, visit tricycle.org/subscribe. And if you'd like to donate, go to tricycle.org/donate. It says tricycle.com. I think they both work. All right. Thank you again, and we hope to see you all soon. Thank you again, Ben.
Okay, thanks.